Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Karen Wiseman. I'm from the Department of English and the Center for Jewish Studies. And welcome to the Ed and Fran Sonshine Holocaust Education Lecture. With thanks to this Ed and Fran Sonshine Fund to provide the opportunity for us to invite such distinguished speakers as Professor Casteel. The title of today's talk is Making History Visible: Black Lives Under Nazism in Literature and Art. And in fact, in Canada, February is Black History Month. And every February, people across Canada participate in Black History Month events and festivities that honor the legacy of Black people in Canada and their communities. And so we're honored to have a speaker today whose talk resonates with the work and the activity of Black History Month. I'd also like to offer the land acknowledgement on behalf of the Center for Jewish Studies. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Sarah Casteel, who's a professor of English at Carleton University, where she's cross-appointed to the Institute of African Studies and the Institute for Comparative Studies in Literature, Art, and Culture. Her most recent books are Calypso Jews, Jewishness and the Caribbean Literary Imagination, which was published in 2016, and which won a Canadian Jewish Literary Award. She's also the co-editor of the truly wonderful volume, Caribbean Jewish Crossings, Literary History and Creative Practice, which was published in 2019. Last spring, Professor Casteel was a visiting fellow at the United States Holocaust Museum, and in 2021, she held the Potsdam Postcolonial Chair in Global Modernities at the University of Potsdam, Germany, of course. Her book, Making History Visible: Black Lives Under Nazism in Literature and Art, is under contract with Columbia University Press. Now help me in welcoming Sarah Casteel.
See if I remember what I'm supposed to do here. Share screen. Okay. Thank you all so much for being here today. Thank you to the Center for Jewish History, for Jewish Studies for the very kind invitation. Thank you, Karen, for the generous introduction. Please let me know if you can't hear me. I don't always have the loudest voice that carries. It's okay in the back? Okay, great. I want to acknowledge the support of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and a number of other institutions and individuals, too numerous really to name, in the Caribbean, the US, Holland, Belgium, Germany, England, and Scotland, that have helped me to trace little-known Black wartime stories, some of which I'd like to share with you today. Above all, I'm indebted to the descendants of two wartime artists, Joseph Nasi and Max Brandel. I come to this project as an outsider to Black culture. At the same time, my approach to the research is informed by my own Eastern European Jewish family's experiences of persecution during the Holocaust. One branch of my family came from a small town near the city of Lvov, Poland, now Lviv, Ukraine. Lvov was also home to Max Brandel, a Polish Jew who would be imprisoned in Germany during the war alongside the Caribbean painter Joseph Nasi. While interned, Brandel drew caricatures of Nasi and other Black prisoners in the camp, as you see on the right side of the slide, just as Nasi himself drew some of the Jewish prisoners, as you see on the left. So my talk today draws inspiration from Nasi's, Brandel's, and other artists' relational perspective on Black and Jewish suffering under the Nazis, And I'll argue that this relational perspective significantly reorients our understanding of the Holocaust and its artistic representation by revealing the entanglement of African diaspora and European wartime histories. In August 2021, Holocaust memorial stones were installed on the Max-Beer-Straße and the Torstraße in Berlin. They joined the more than 75,000 other Stolpersteine or stumbling stones that have been laid since the mid-1990s in Germany and across Europe in front of the former residences of victims of the Third Reich. These two stones were distinctive, however, in commemorating individuals of African descent. Martha Ndumbe, who was of Cameroonian and German heritage and perished at Ravensbrück in 1945, and Ferdinand James Allen, who was of Caribbean and German heritage and was killed at the Bernburg Psychiatric Hospital in 1941. Their installation brought the number of Stolpersteine dedicated to Black victims to a total of 4. The first such stone, also located in Berlin's Mitte district, was installed in 2007 in memory of Mujib bin Adam Mohammed, a colonial soldier and film actor from Dar es Salaam, who perished in Sachsenhausen in 1944. The second was laid in 2009 in Frankfurt to commemorate Hagar Martin Brown, a South African who died in 1940 as a result of Nazi medical experiments. Along with other recent memorialization projects, such as France's call to rename French streets after African and Caribbean Allied soldiers, the dedication of these 4 Stolpersteine marked the emergence of a public recognition of Black people as being among both Hitler's victims and Europe's liberators. Long before the installation of these memorial stones, however, Black victims of Nazi persecution had documented their experiences in their wartime artwork and post-war testimonies. Moreover, starting in the late 1980s, a number of African diaspora writers and artists who had not themselves experienced the Nazi regime began to imaginatively recover these victims' stories through the mnemonic mediums of literature and visual art. While the appearance of many of these post-memorial artworks coincided with the Holocaust memory boom of the late 20th century, for the most part, they did not gain much traction. Instead, they anticipated a shift in memory culture that is only now underway, catalyzed in the public sphere by Black European activism and the Black Lives Matter movement, and in academia by the growth of Black European studies and by the colonial turn in Holocaust studies. So probing the boundaries of Holocaust art and memory, my research draws attention to a largely unrecognized corpus of literature and visual art that addresses Black experience in wartime Europe. This corpus and its often ambivalent reception reveal how entrenched categories of art and victimhood can obstruct our access to the past and obscure connections among histories, identities, and aesthetic traditions that conventionally have been perceived as separate. While this body of art recovers a neglected past, my interest as a cultural critic lies less in securing historical facts than in understanding how artworks produce, reshape, and circulate memory. In line with a cultural memory studies approach, I consider the role of art in the formation of collective memory and how art's aesthetic qualities contribute to its mnemonic force. My corpus illustrates that art operates not only as a vehicle, but also as an agent of memory, challenging the systemic erasure of Black wartime histories and perspectives. The artworks I examine serve as a counterweight to hegemonic narratives of the past. At the heart of this research, then, is the relationship between art, memory, and resistance. Unlike Jews and the Roma and Sinti, people of African descent were not systematically targeted by the Nazis for elimination. Nonetheless, they suffered a variety of forms of persecution during the Nazi period, including ostracization, forced sterilization, incarceration in labor, internment, and concentration camps, medical experimentation, and death. As the biographies of the 4 victims of African descent commemorated by Stolpersteine attest, the small population was heterogeneous. It included Black Europeans, many of whom were of dual African and European heritage, African Caribbean and African American expatriates who traveled to Europe in search of educational and employment opportunities, and colonial and African American troops. Among the African-American emigres were a number of jazz musicians, such as the pianist Freddie Johnson, who chose to stay in Europe when the war broke out rather than return to the segregated American society they had sought to escape. Others who fell victim to the Nazi regime included POWs, such as the Senegalese writer and statesman Léopold Sédar Senghor, members of the resistance, such as the Surinamese anti-colonial thinker Antoine de Kom, and the Congolese Dachau prisoner Jean Vosté, who you see on the slide here, and children of former German colonial subjects, such as the Black German memoirist Theodor Michael. The experiences of this victim group remain a largely untold chapter in the history of the Third Reich. The central problem confronted by the writers and artists that I discuss is the invisibility of Black European wartime experience. This invisibility does not simply bespeak a passive or casual disregard for Black history. Rather, it needs to be understood as an active and systematic practice of disavowal. A particularly vivid illustration of this practice was the deliberate removal of Black colonial soldiers from the unit that liberated Paris in August 1944. While 2/3 of the Free French forces were Black, the Allied High Command insisted that Paris must be seen to be liberated by white soldiers. As this example of the visual excision of Black colonial soldiers from the European theater of war attests, history is not simply a fixed reality. Instead, as the Haitian scholar Michel Rolf-Trouillot emphasizes, history is both a social process and a narrative of the past that expresses our relationship to historical knowledge. Accordingly, every historical narrative is attended by a particular bundle of silences, as Trouillot put it, silences that reflect the relations of power and present conditions in which that narrative is produced. Notably, inherent in the processual and unfixed character of historical knowledge is the potential for the emergence of new counter-hegemonic narratives of the past that is the primary focus of my research. In silencing the past, Trouillot takes issue with theories of history for failing to recognize the extent to which historical knowledge is produced in sites situated outside of academia. A case in point is the artistic corpus that I'd like to introduce to you today, which actively and creatively intervenes into the collective memory of World War II and the Holocaust. In her book, Other Germans, Tina Kampt offers an illuminating analysis of Black German oral histories as memory technologies that transform memory, quote, into public texts accessible to interpretation, while also functioning as a mode of articulation and construction of identity, experience, events, and history, unquote. I'd like to suggest that alongside the compelling Black German oral histories discussed by Tina Kampt, literature and art are key mnemonic technologies, so that in the words of novelist Essie Adugin, art too is a defense against erasure. Moreover, as counter-memorial agents, artistic mediums offer particular advantages. As memory studies scholars have shown, because of their poetic license and aesthetic qualities, literary genres and other art forms often have a greater staying power than other modes of remembrance. This capacity of art to store and circulate knowledge of the past and to make that knowledge stick becomes still more pronounced, I argue, in the context of invisibilized histories. In such a context, artworks do not simply act as relay stations and stabilizers of memory, to use Anne Rigney's terminology, but they can also serve as catalysts for the emergence of new or neglected memories. In the case of the artworks I'll discuss today, they do so by producing unfamiliar images of World War II and the Holocaust, in which European and African diaspora histories emerge as deeply entangled with one another. So what I'd like to do now is to offer you several key examples that demonstrate this counter-memorial function of art in the context of Black wartime history. I'll begin with testimonial art produced during the war, and then I'll turn to a couple examples of post-memorial works that imaginatively reconstruct wartime experience. Exercising the particular affordances of their respective mediums, painting, fiction, and photomontage, each work illustrates the role of the artist as a producer of historical knowledge. Yet I'll argue that ultimately these artworks are less engaged in documenting or recovering historical facts than in what Jana Brown calls acts of creative mourning. Okay, so this is my first of 3 examples. Buried in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's storage facility in suburban Washington are a series of drawings and paintings by Joseph Nasi, a little-known Caribbean artist of African and Sephardic Jewish descent. And I'm happy to say more about the Sephardic family history in the Q&A. I don't have time to go into it now, but it's I think quite fascinating. From 1942 to 1945, Joseph Nasi was interned in Nazi Germany alongside a number of other Black prisoners. During his imprisonment, he created a poignant and extensive visual diary that constitutes a unique visual document of Black civilian internment. With its encoded and compressed character, Nasi's internment art records Black wartime perspectives that remain unarticulated in textual records of the camps. And I want to emphasize at the outset that Nasi was imprisoned in an internment camp, not in a concentration camp where the material conditions would have been much worse. Nonetheless, so I don't want to confuse the two. Nonetheless, I think that his artwork opens up an important alternative perspective on the Nazi camp system that reveals the heterogeneity of its prisoner population. Nasi's biography exhibits a pattern of emancipatory emigration and self-invention that also characterizes many of the other figures of African descent that I've encountered in my research. After spending his early years in the Dutch Caribbean colony of Suriname, where he was born in 1904, Nasi moved in 1918 to New York City, where he attended high school and earned a degree in electrical engineering. Much like a number of African Americans during the interwar years, Nasi eventually sought greater freedom and prospects through emigration to Europe. The opportunity came in 1929 when he was sent to England to install sound systems for the first talking movies. Nasi subsequently settled in Brussels, where he married a Belgian woman and studied painting at the Académie des Beaux-Arts. Paradoxically, Nasi's emancipatory migration to Europe exposed him to a different regime of racial oppression that took hold with the rise of the Third Reich. Following the German occupation of Belgium and the entry of the United States into the war, Nasi was arrested as an enemy alien in April 1942. After being held in a transit camp in Belgium, he was transferred for the duration of the war to 2 civilian POW camps, Elag 7 in Laufen, Bavaria, and its subcamp in the neighboring village of Tittmoning. So Elag meaning Internierungslager or internment camp. While it may seem counterintuitive, Nasi was arrested neither because of his skin color nor because of his Jewish ancestry, but because of his citizenship. When he had emigrated to Europe, Nasi had falsely claimed US citizenship by changing the place and date of his birth, an act of self-reinvention that would profoundly shape his wartime experience, as it turned out. Thanks to his falsified US citizenship, Nasi was interned as an Allied prisoner and granted the protections of the Geneva Convention. The International YMCA supplied the internment camp with art supplies that enabled Nasi to produce over 200 paintings and drawings, comprising interior and exterior scenes, as well as portraits in pencil, ink, and oil paint. The work's muted palette, bleak imagery, and stark composition convey the loneliness, anxiety, and deprivation of daily life in Nazi civilian POW camps. The psychological challenges of internment find their deepest expression in Nasi's moving portraits of his fellow prisoners. In keeping with other art created in the Nazi camp system, the genre that dominates the collection is portraiture. Somewhat atypically for internment portraiture, however, Nasi does not include any textual information identifying his subjects, and I'll say a bit more about that later. Nasi's portraits are also unusual in that many of them portray Black internees, 16 of whom were imprisoned alongside him in Elag 7. While most were African-American musicians and entertainers, one was a West African who had been in the British Navy. In one of his most complex oil compositions, Nasi portrays 9 of the Black prisoners in their cramped barracks in Tittmoning Castle in 1943. Here, the thick application of paint and gray and brown tones generates an atmosphere of airless enclosure. In the background, one prisoner faces away from the viewer at a silent piano, while 4 others sit or lie in their bunks. In the foreground, 3 seated figures are occupied with preparing or eating food and playing the guitar. Meanwhile, a 4th prisoner stares out at the viewer, his raised eyebrows and direct gaze inviting us to engage with and witness the scene. Head tilted to one side, right hand resting on his knee, shoulders slumped and legs splayed, he appears resigned to his fate, his passive pose conveying the despair and helplessness of his situation. In the upper left-hand corner of the canvas, we see what I believe to be Nasi himself at work at an easel while perched on his bunk. This embedded self-portrait signals how, as an imprisoned artist, Nasi reclaimed some degree of agency and control by organizing the visual elements that make up this scene of disempowerment. Nasi's portrait of the Black internees communicates in a concentrated fashion possible only through a visual medium the prisoner's psychological and material predicament. The composition suggests the emotional and political relationships forged among the prisoners by the racialized conditions of their internment, which included being bunked together in a confined space. Notably, however, each of the prisoners appears lost in his own thoughts. The men do not converse, and their gazes are directed away from one another. Thus, while their spatial assembly can be read as an affirmation of group solidarity, Nasi maintains a sense of their individuality while hinting at possible fragmentation. In keeping with the genre of civic group portraiture, Nasi's composition seeks to balance the simultaneous expression of group solidarity, equality, and individuality. A double portrait that Nasi painted the following year likely depicts the African-American jazz musicians Johnny Mitchell and Henry Crowder. As in the group portrait, here Nasi presents the 2 prisoners in the austere, claustrophobic atmosphere of the medieval castle that served as their barracks. In contrast to the stiff, motionless posture characteristic of individual portraits, the men's more casual poses convey their enforced intimacy and shared identity as prisoners. Mitchell is seated on the top bunk of a bed playing the guitar, while Crowder lies on the bunk below reading, his head propped up in his left hand. Intent on their activities, the prisoners' knitted brows and heavily shadowed faces convey the psychological challenges of internment. Nasi's internment art illustrates the capacity of visual media to document a hypervisible prisoner population that nonetheless has remained hidden from view in the collective memory of World War II. Recording the particular conditions of Black civilian internment, the Nasi collection at the same time promotes a relational understanding by positioning the Black prisoners' experiences as intimately connected to those of other victim groups it depicts, including a number of Polish Jewish prisoners who were in the same camp. Moreover, by virtue of Nasi's Caribbean origins and the colonial backgrounds of some of the other internees he portrayed, the collection reveals the interpenetration of Europe and colonial wartime experience. Another rare visual record of the Black presence in Elag 7 are several photographs also in the USHMM collection. Taken by an unknown photographer, images of the jazz pianist Freddie Johnson and guitarist Johnny Mitchell performing while imprisoned in Tipmoning in 1943 or 44 give little indication of the camp setting or its material or psychological challenges. In one photograph, Johnson plays the piano in the foreground while Mitchell accompanies him on the guitar. Here, Johnson is animated, his mouth open in a wide grin, his hand hovering in midair above the keys, his eyes engaging an audience situated beyond the picture's frame. By contrast, Nasi's 4 drawings of Johnson show an unsmiling, pensive figure gazing down at the music, his furrowed brow suggesting preoccupation or worry. And sometimes when I've presented this collection in other places, some people have commented on Nasi's paintings and said that they don't feel that the figures look that sort of distressed. But I want to say that part of my interpretation of the paintings and drawings comes from juxtaposing them and comparing them with these other visual representations of the camp, including these photographs. Nazis' portraits of the Black prisoners of Gulag 7 also contrast with cartoons and caricatures created in the camp. While caricature had significant value in the context of internment as a satirical mode that could evade censors and convey sharp critique, it draws on a racialized register of imagery characteristic of the period that is not adapted to conveying the psychological complexity communicated by Nazis' paintings and drawings. Juxtaposed with other examples of the visual culture of the internment camps, including photography and caricature, Nazis' art reveals the varying capacity of different modes of visual representation to preserve the memory of a marginalized prisoner population. Okay, I'll turn now to the second set of examples. In the 1990s and early 2000s, Black wartime stories, such as that of Joseph Nasi and the jazz musicians with whom he was imprisoned, helped to inspire a number of works of fiction by African diaspora writers who had not themselves experienced Nazi persecution. The plots of these novels hinge on the discovery of a testimonial object that provides an opening to memory. By exhibiting the fictionalized testimonial object for the reader, the novels compensate for gaps in the archive of World War II, much as slavery fiction supplies voices of enslaved people that are missing from the colonial archive. So turning now from image to text and from testimonial art to post-war imaginative reconstruction, I'd like to briefly discuss two works of jazz fiction. African-American writer John A. Williams's 1999 novel, Clifford's Blues, and a work that may be more familiar to Canadian audiences, Ghanaian-Canadian writer Essie Aduchin's 2011 novel, Half-Blood Blues. Combining Holocaust fiction's documentary effect with jazz fiction's polyvocality, these novels excavate the forgotten stories of expatriate Black musicians, such as Arthur Briggs and Valletta Snow, both of whom I've pictured on the slide here. Expatriate musicians who were working in Europe when the war broke out and who faced the dilemma of whether to remain on the continent or return to difficult conditions at home. In so doing, the novels illustrate the capacity of jazz fiction to produce revisionary wartime narratives. In Clifford's Blues, the classic blues narrative of an uprooted, suffering individual navigating an alien world is transposed to an unexpected setting, the Dachau concentration camp. Williams's novel centers on a gay African-American jazz pianist named Clifford, who is arrested by the Gestapo in Berlin in 1933. In Dachau, Clifford struggles not only to survive, but to have his existence recognized. After Clifford is arrested, his hopes of being released are dashed when he is told that, quote, "It looks like I don't exist. They say the embassy claims it has no record of me," unquote. Acutely conscious of such erasures, Williams's central concern in the novel is the recovery, preservation, and circulation of memory. The novel opens with a dedication to those without memorial or monument, thereby positioning itself as a literary memorial to forgotten Black victims of Nazi persecution. Clifford's Blues consists of a series of dated diary entries spanning May 1933 to April 1945, with no chapter divisions or other overtly novelistic devices other than an epigraph and two letters that bookend the diary. The reader becomes the recipient of this fictionalized testimony, which Clifford composes during his incarceration to console himself and to document the atrocities to which he bears witness. Clifford's clandestine diary imaginatively records the unwritten history of Black victims of the Third Reich against the background of the establishment of the Nazi racial state and the camp system. Like other works of Holocaust fiction, Clifford's Blues closely mimics the formal features of testimonial literature, capitalizing on the immediacy of the diary form, its evidentiary function, and its ability to combat dehumanization. Similarly, Aduchin's novel Half-Blood Blues recovers Black wartime history by revisiting the jazz scene in interwar and wartime Europe and by deploying the literary device of the found testimonial object. In contrast to Williams' diary novel, however, Half-Blood Blues allocates the first-person perspective the first person narration, not to the Black concentration camp victim, but to a problematic African-American bystander figure. Resisting the testimonial mode in favor of a nonlinear and heavily mediated narrative structure, Edugyan's postmodern novel destabilizes the realist project of historical recovery pursued by Williams. In Half-Blood Blues, young American and European jazz musicians in interwar Berlin form a band called the Hot Time Swingers. The band's Black German trumpet player, Hieronymus, is one of the children pejoratively named Rhineland bastards, who were born to white German mothers and French colonial troops who were stationed in the occupied Rhineland after World War I. This population was perceived by the Nazis as a Jewish orchestrated threat of racial contamination to the Volksgemeinschaft, or national body, and was subjected to forced sterilization in the late 1930s. In the novel's replaying of this historical episode, after fleeing Germany, Hieronymus is arrested by the Nazis and occupied Paris in 1940 and imprisoned in the Mauthausen concentration camp. Moving between the wartime years and the early 1990s, Half-Blood Blues traces the efforts of his former bandmates, musicologists, and documentary filmmakers to determine what happened to him after his deportation. These attempts to solve the mystery of Hieronymus's fate at the hands of the Nazis are emblematic of Edugyan's larger literary project of investigating a lost chapter of wartime history. Simulating jazz music's circular structure and interplay of voices, Half-Blood Blues suggests that jazz's aesthetic strategies offer the writer crucial resources for such a project. Memory studies theorist Astrid Earle notes that literary narrative is distinguished by its capacity to be simultaneously memory productive and memory reflexive. In keeping with this observation, the epistolary frame of Williams's novel draws attention to the circulation of Clifford's diary and to the transmission of the memories it contains to the present-day reader. In Edugyan's novel, literary discourse's capacity to reflect on the production of memory becomes still more apparent. Oscillating between different historical moments and circling back to key episodes like a record that keeps turning in its grooves, the novel invites the reader to consider how memories of the past are continually reshaped according to the needs of the present. Edugyan's novel repeatedly draws attention to the difficulty of producing a historical narrative of Black experience under the Nazis, even as it purports to do precisely that. For example, in a documentary screened at a Berlin festival, a scholar explains, quote, "Of course, it's hard to get a sense of how many Blacks actually went to the camps because so many records were destroyed. These people are lost in the dark maw of history," unquote. It's only by virtue of the recovery of a testimonial object, in this case not a diary, but musical discs, that the memory of the Black victim endures. Much like Clifford's Blues, then, Half-Blood Blues transmits a neglected memory to the reader through the device of a found object. Yet as testimonial objects, Edugyan's jazz records prove more opaque than Williams's fictionalized concentration camp diary. While appearing to build towards Hieronymus's firsthand account of Mauthausen, Half-Blood Blues ultimately withholds his concentration camp testimony from the reader. Undermining the trope of testimonial authority, Edugyan's approach to historical fiction resembles that of postmodern slavery novels of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. These novels questioned the recuperative claims made by earlier realist instances of the genre. Often characterized by a fragmented temporal structure, they were less interested in recovering a historical truth than in challenging traditional historiography and exploring the legacies of the past in the present. However, if Edugyan's novel calls into question historical fiction's capacity to repair gaps in the archive, a still more profound challenge to the truth claims of realist representation is issued by my final example, a work of photomontage that is haunted by the legacy of the Holocaust and its connections to African diaspora experience. Okay, this is my last of the three examples. So how does one visualize an invisible history? This is the central question that animated the late Scottish Ghanaian artist and writer Maud Salter's work, and in particular her 1993 photomontage series Circus, which is Circus in Welsh. Inspired by Weimar photographer August Sander's photographs of Black circus workers and influenced by the collages of German Dada artist Hannah Hook, Salter's eerie photomontages visually invoke both ethnographic object photography and Nazi landscape aesthetics to unsettle assumptions about the relationship of African diaspora populations to European spaces. Read alongside its companion poem, Blood Money, Circus is particularly striking for its refusal of portraiture and realist modes of representation. Salter's haunted alpine scenes draw attention to Black European wartime histories, even as they simultaneously call into question the recuperative capacity of art. Salter conceived of Circus as the scrapbook of a fictional Black German girl named Helga, who is also the subject of her prose poem Blood Money that was displayed alongside the photomontages. In Blood Money, we learn that Helga is the daughter of a Cameroonian woman named Monique, who joins a French circus troupe in 1926, and a Black German man named Kwesi. After the Nazis come to power, Kwesi is imprisoned in a concentration camp, while Helga is subjected to forced sterilization. And I quote from the poem, "For the child of the circus, there would be no reparation for a sterilized womb, family torn apart, incarcerated, in forced labor, concentration camp internment, leading for Kwesi to death with the gypsies, Jews, and gays, and the others." Helga's family story condenses the history of African colonial subjects' immigration to Europe and the fate that they and their descendants suffered under the Nazis. The poem concludes by situating this untold wartime history as part of a series of Holocausts, ranging from slavery, the witch trials, and pogroms to the Bosnian genocide of the early 1990s. The poem's refrain is "Close your eyes and imagine a German." Repeated 4 times, this refrain problematizes constructions of German identity and history that erase African diaspora presences. Moreover, the speaker suggests that the traumatic experiences of Black people under the Nazis cannot be addressed through traditional verse form, remarking towards the end of the poem, "There's no way I can make this poem rhyme." Instead, the poem's division into verse paragraphs without line breaks brings it closer to prose. At the same time, by employing poetic devices such as compression and repetition, Salter resists the linear emplotment and narrative closure that characterize fiction and narrative history. Still more resistant to narrativizing the past is the Noir et Blanc series in Circus, which, unlike its companion poem, does not offer a portrait of the Black German girl Helga or her Cameroonian mother Monique. As art historian Deborah Cherry remarks, Helga and the spectral female protagonists of several of Salter's other works do not cross the threshold of visibility. Instead, by pairing the photomontages with the poem, Salter indirectly implies Helga's presence as the creator of the scrapbook whose pages make up the images in Circus. The source of the object photographs is Frank Willett's African art from the Thames and Hudson World of Art series. In Circus, Salter excises and contextualizes Willett's images of African objects in a resonant act of reappropriation that comments on the discourse of ethnographic photography. She mounts the black and white photographs from Willett on an old album of postcards featuring touristic alpine scenes. Alluding to the Nazis' encoding of the Alps as an Aryan landscape, and I've included an image of Hitler's Berghof retreat in the Bavarian Alps there. Alluding to that Nazi landscape aesthetic, Salter's choice of setting suggests the capacity of the picturesque to mask violence. Helga and the Black circus workers photographed by August Sander haunt the pages of the scrapbook and the alpine landscapes they display. It's become fairly commonplace to draw comparisons between African slavery and the Holocaust and the commemorative practices that surround these historical traumas. Circus asserts, however, that questions of Blackness are also embedded within the problem of Holocaust memorialization. Helga's scrapbook reveals intersections between African diaspora and Holocaust memory that are not only symbolic, but also concretely historical. Circus's unpeopled, eerie alpine landscapes are the repository of the absent presences and inherited memories of forgotten Black victims of Nazi persecution. As unmarked sites of memory, the haunting alpine scenes evoke both Toni Morrison's rememory and Mariana Hirsch's post-memory. They simultaneously suggest the repetition of the repressed trauma of slavery portrayed by Morrison and the intergenerational transmission of Holocaust trauma theorized by Hirsch. Salter was acutely conscious of the role of photography as an instrument of human classification. In her 1989 essay, The Nature of Photography, she compiled a list of the uses and abuses to which photography had been put, including surveillance, immigration control, and racial categorization. Salter emphasized that, quote, photography is not a tool, it's a weapon. Its birth pangs ran concurrent with the abolition of slavery, and many of the uses to which it was first put was that of categorizing the other. Salter's commentary on photography as an instrument of racial classification illuminates her pronounced resistance to photographic portraiture in Circus. The absence of the human image in the Noir et Blanc series suggests a critique of the invisibility of Black Europeans and thematizes the extent to which Black culture has been represented in Europe through African artifacts obtained through colonial appropriation. If Joseph Nassi's internment portraits consolidated a human presence that was under threat, in Circus, Salter diffuses Helga's presence, instead refocusing the viewer's gaze on an iconic European landscape. The images of ethnographic objects that Salter selected for the first two montages invoke an ancestral African presence. In Noir et Blanc 1, an aerial view of an alpine village framed by majestic mountains and fir trees is partially obscured by an Afo wooden sculpture from Nigeria of a seated mother suckling her child. According to Willett, which was the source for Salter of the images, the female figure represents the mother of the Afo people. The mother and child hover above the alpine village, just slightly off center, their large scale relative to the village and the mother's proud demeanor, powerfully asserting a historical Black presence at the very center of Europe. At the same time, the figure's suspension in the air above the village suggests a certain ephemerality, a difficulty rooting in the landscape. Ancestors are still more insistently evoked in Noir et Blanc 2, which similarly positions an imposing wooden carving in the center of an alpine scene, this time a Kota reliquary figure from Gabon or Congo used to protect the bones of family members. The viewer is confronted by the large oval face, impressive coiffure, prominent eyes, and diamond-shaped body of the two-dimensional reliquary figure, which is seen head-on, suspended above the tree line that occupies the lower foreground. Behind the reliquary is a quaint alpine village with mountains and blue sky. Viewed at eye level, the alpine village appears empty of a human presence. In Circus, the substitution of African objects for human figures and the genre of ethnographic photography for portraiture suggests that the history of Black people in early and mid-20th century Europe is not readily retrievable. While Circus alludes to an African diaspora presence in wartime Europe, it does not attempt to reconstruct that presence, which is available only through the problematic mediation of ethnographic photography. In Circus, Salter ultimately is less interested in recovering a forgotten past than in reflecting on the ways of seeing and structures of power that have prevented its apprehension. Salter critiques and exposes these mechanisms of invisibility through photomontage, a medium that has its own historical investment in the category of the exotic. Her assemblages juxtapose two seemingly unrelated modes of visual representation, the picturesque and ethnographic art photography, that emerge as mutually implicated in an imperial gaze. Bringing alpine idols and ethnographic imagery into the same visual plane, Salter exposes their common capacity for erasure and the power of landscape representation to naturalize certain identities at the expense of others. Okay, I'm just going to briefly conclude now. In her study of Holocaust testimony, Zoe Waxman argues that the concept of the Holocaust and the term Holocaust survivor project a problematic singularity that belies the heterogeneity of the experiences that they designate. Employing a range of different mediums and genres, the African diaspora artists I examine reinscribe Black wartime perspectives that challenge the universal identity of the Holocaust victim. Moreover, their writing and visual art attest that art, with its creative license and mnemonic staying power, has a key role to play in reorienting our understanding of the past. Yet if these artworks position themselves as intervening into collective memory, what exactly is the nature of their intervention? I would suggest that these works are engaged not only in a project of recovery, but also in a project of disruption, to borrow Tina Kamp's distinction. The works of visual art and fiction that I've discussed today use their poetic license to imaginatively fill gaps in the archive to recover the past. Yet at the same time, to varying degrees, they also signal the irreparable nature of those gaps. In so doing, they disrupt and disorder the conventions of Holocaust memorialization that produced the bundles of silences surrounding Black wartime experience. As I noted earlier, atypically for internment camp art, Joseph Nasi failed to include textual information identifying the figures he portrayed, frustrating the researcher's efforts to ascertain the identity of his Black subjects. And it is very frustrating for those of us trying to figure out who these people were. Nasi instead offers the viewer a different order of historical knowledge by communicating emotional and psychological truths about the experiences of Black civilian internees that are unavailable elsewhere in the archive. For their part, John Williams's and Essie Adujan's jazz novels mimic testimonial forms and exhibit testimonial objects, thereby appearing to supply the missing facts of history. Yet the fictional status of Clifford's concentration camp diary means that the reader's desire to receive the Black victim's testimony must finally remain unsatisfied. Adujan's novel renders the fantasy of a stable and recoverable past even more untenable by withholding the Black victim's testimony altogether. Still more radically, Maud Salter's photomontages eschew portraiture and resist the truth claims of realism in favor of an elusive spectral engagement with the past that exposes the epistemic mechanisms of erasure. Each of these artworks negotiates between a powerful desire to recover a marginalized history to make it visible and a simultaneous recognition of the impossibility of redeeming the past. Inhabiting this tension between recuperation and disruption, the artworks open up an imaginative space in which we can mourn a victim group whose stories will never be fully known. Thank you all so much.